I moved to a strange town in Idaho. There are strange rules to follow. When I first arrived in Briarwood, I thought I had found the perfect escape, a quiet, isolated town surrounded by endless forests. But then, I was given a list of rules. Rules that weren't just weird. They were terrifying. Do not open the door if you hear knocking at night. Do not react to the whistling outside. Do not look at it. I thought it was just superstition. I was wrong. Now something knows my name. Something is inside my house, and no matter how many rules I follow, I can't escape. Subscribe to Mr. Quentin for more terrifying real-life horror stories. Hit that notification bell before it's too late. I arrived in Briarwood, Idaho, on a bitterly cold November evening. It was nothing more than a tiny speck on the map, an isolated, quiet town surrounded by dense pine forests. The air carried the damp scent of earth, the sky stretched endlessly above, and the silence was so deep it seemed to seep into my bones. It was exactly what I needed. I wasn't here to start over. I was here to escape. To escape a failed marriage, a job that had drained me dry, and a life that had shrunk so small, it felt suffocating. I had stumbled upon Briarwood by chance, buried in an online rental listing, a small, single-story cabin on the outskirts of town, offered at a price so low it felt like a miracle. No neighbors, no noise, just me and the whispering pines beyond the backyard fence. It was perfect. The landlord, Mr. Holloway, was a tall, wiry man with bony hands and a handshake that cracked like dry twigs. He gave me a brief tour of the house, saying little, but just before I signed the lease, he slid a piece of paper across the table. A list of rules. The night rules of Briarwood, strictly enforced. I frowned, scanning the page. Outside, the wind hissed through the treetops, and for the first time, a strange feeling crept over me, like I had just stepped into a place that didn't quite belong to the world I thought I knew. Rule 1. Keep all doors and windows locked from 2 a.m. until sunrise. No exceptions. Rule 2. If you hear knocking between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., do not open the door. Ignore it. Rule 3. If you hear whistling outside after 2 a.m., do not react. Shut your eyes, cover your ears, and let it pass. Rule 4. Under no circumstances should you go outside after 2 a.m. Rule 5. Do not discuss these rules with anyone who doesn't already know them. I laughed. It had to be some kind of small-town prank, an old superstition, a bit of local folklore meant to scare outsiders like me. But Mr. Holloway didn't laugh. He simply pushed the paper closer, his pale eyes unreadable, his face set in stone. Read them. Follow them. Or leave now. There was something in his voice, something flat, cold, and entirely without humor. A small shiver ran down my spine, but I forced myself to shrug it off. I took the paper. I moved in. I locked my doors every night. For the first few days, nothing happened. Briarwood was a sleepy town, the kind of place where the streets were empty even in the afternoon. The air smelled like pine and distant rain, the sky stretched endlessly above, and at night, the silence settled thick and absolute. I settled into a routine, morning coffee on the porch, long walks in the woods behind my house, reading until I dozed off in the evenings. But on the 5th night, I found out why the rules existed. It was past midnight when I woke up, the room unnervingly still. I didn't know what had roused me, but the quiet felt wrong, too deep, too expectant. I reached for my phone. 1:57 a.m. The feeling of unease tightened around me like a fist. I sat up, listening. Nothing. Just the wind stirring the trees outside. I shook my head at myself and was about to lie back down when, knock. A single, sharp knock at the front door. I froze. Another knock. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Maybe someone was lost? Maybe an animal had bumped into the door? Knock, knock, knock. 3 precise, deliberate raps. A memory surfaced. The list of rules. Rule 2. If you hear knocking between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., do not open the door. Ignore it. My pulse pounded. It had to be a joke. Maybe some bored teenager testing the new guy. Maybe it was just my imagination. I stayed perfectly still. The knocking didn't come again. Minutes crawled by. My phone screen glowed in the dark. 2 a.m. I exhaled, relief flooding me. Probably nothing. Probably just my paranoia. And then, from the woods outside, a whistle. Low, melodic, rising and falling in an unfamiliar tune. I gripped the sheets, my breath catching. My body went rigid. Rule 3. If you hear whistling outside after 2 a.m., do not react. Shut your eyes, cover your ears, and let it pass. A trickle of ice slid down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to look, to peek out the window to see what was out there. But I didn't. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut, pressed my hands over my ears, and focused on my breathing. The whistling grew louder, closer. It circled the house, slow and deliberate. A shadow passed by my window. I couldn't see it. My eyes were shut tight. But I felt it. A presence. Something just on the other side of the glass, watching, waiting. The whistling continued, lilting and playful. I counted the seconds. It didn't leave. Minutes stretched into eternity. My knees ached from clenching so hard. My lungs burned from the shallow way I was breathing. Then, finally, silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, but when I dared to open my eyes, the room was empty. The world outside was still. My phone screen read 5:47 a.m. sunrise. I made it. I didn't sleep the next night, or the night after that. During the day, Briarwood was unchanged. The same quiet streets, the same empty roads, the same polite smiles from townsfolk who looked at me just a second too long before turning away. I wanted to ask. I wanted to demand answers. But then I remembered Rule 5. Do not discuss these rules with anyone who doesn't already know them. And I realized everyone already knew. Mr. Holloway, the waitress at the diner who warned me not to stay out too late, the postman who never delivered anything past dusk. They all knew. They just didn't talk about it. So I didn't either. But at night, when the wind whispered through the trees and the sky stretched vast and black above me, I waited, and I listened, for the knocks, for the whistles, for whatever was out there. Because I knew it was waiting too. I woke up at 2:13 a.m. to the sound of knocking, not the kind of knocking you'd expect from a late-night visitor, not frantic, not hurried. It was slow, deliberate, heavy. One knock, a pause, 2, 3. A perfect rhythm, 3 seconds apart, each knock deep and resonant, like someone pressing their fist against the wood instead of using their knuckles. I sat up so fast my head spun. My heart pounded against my ribs. 3 more knocks. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking. No missed calls, no messages, no reason for anyone to be at my door at this hour. The knocking stopped. Silence. 10 seconds of nothing. Then, just as I exhaled, I heard it. A whistle. Low and haunting, it wove through the trees outside, melodic yet wrong in a way I couldn't quite place. The tune rose and fell, lilting, playful almost, but there was something off about it. Like a song played on an instrument slightly out of tune. And it was moving, growing louder, then fading, like someone circling the house. I clenched the sheets, my breath caught in my throat. Rule 3. If you hear whistling outside after 2 a.m., do not react. Shut your eyes, cover your ears, and let it pass. I should have listened, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, staring at my bedroom door, straining to hear more. For the first time since I moved in, I wanted to look. I wanted to creep to the window, press my face against the glass, and see what was out there. But I knew better, so I stayed in bed, frozen in place, waiting for whatever was outside to leave. I don't know how long I lay there, maybe minutes, maybe hours, but I didn't move. I barely breathed. Eventually, the whistling faded, and just like that, it was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn finally crept in through my window, I forced myself to move. My body ached from staying so still, my throat dry as sandpaper. I got up, walked to the front door, and hesitated. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I had to. Slowly, I unlatched the locks and pulled the door open. The morning air was crisp, biting against my skin. Everything was normal. The trees stood tall. The sky was pale with the early sun, and the world felt ordinary again. But then I saw them. Footprints. Bare footprints. They trailed across the frost-covered ground, leading from my front door to the edge of the forest. I stepped forward, my pulse hammering. The prints were too large to be a child's, but too narrow to belong to any man I had ever met. And they ended, abruptly, at the tree line. Not fading, not disappearing into the dirt, just stopping. Like whoever, or whatever, had made them, had simply vanished into thin air. A gust of wind stirred the branches. For a split second, I felt watched. I slammed the door shut. I didn't leave the house that day. I barely ate, barely moved. I spent hours staring at the footprints from my window, watching as the morning sun melted them away. By noon, they were gone. By sunset, I almost convinced myself I had imagined them. Almost. But then night fell again, and at 2 a.m. I heard the first knock. Slow, deliberate, exactly 3 seconds apart. And I knew. I wasn't imagining anything. They were real, and they were coming back. I barely slept after that night. Even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The trees around my house seemed taller, their shadows stretching a little too far. Every creak of the old wooden floors sent a shiver up my spine. The rules weren't a joke. They weren't some small-town superstition. They were real, and whatever was out there, it knew I had heard it. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I grabbed my keys and drove into town. Briarwood had only one diner, a small place at the corner of Main Street. A flickering neon sign buzzed above the entrance, and the smell of fresh coffee and bacon drifted through the air. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, where the same few regulars sat at the same booths every morning, where conversations were whispered rather than spoken. I pushed open the door, and a bell jingled above my head. The woman behind the counter, Maggie, looked up. She was older, with streaks of silver in her dark hair and the tired expression of someone who had lived in Briarwood too long. She gave me a polite nod, wiping her hands on a towel as she poured coffee into a ceramic mug. I slid into a booth, my hands gripping a crumpled piece of paper, the rules. I hesitated, then placed it on the counter in front of her. These rules... My voice felt too loud in the quiet diner. Are they real? Maggie's hand froze mid-pour. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she set the coffee pot down and turned to face me. Her fingers curled tightly around the towel in her hands. Did you follow them last night? She asked. I swallowed. Yeah. She nodded once. Good. Then she turned away as if the conversation was over. But I wasn't done. I leaned forward. Maggie, please, I need to know what's going on. She shook her head, her shoulders stiff. You don't need to know anything, she said, voice firm. I opened my mouth to argue, but then I saw it. Her eyes flicked past me, over my shoulder, and widened with fear. I turned. A man stood near the entrance. He was old, wiry, with a face like weathered stone and piercing gray eyes that locked onto mine the moment I turned around. He was watching me, and he wasn't blinking. He took a step closer, his boots heavy against the diner floor. You're new, he rasped. I nodded, unsure of what to say. Another step. His voice dropped lower. You heard it, didn't you? I hesitated, my throat dry. The whistling. His expression darkened. A long silence stretched between us, the sounds of the diner fading into nothing. The air felt heavier, colder. Then he leaned in, his breath carrying the scent of coffee and something stale. Listen to me, he whispered. You need to follow the rules. Don't talk about it. And most importantly, don't ever go looking for answers. I frowned. Why not? His eyes, already grim, turned sharp with something else, something like fear. He exhaled shakily, then spoke the words that sent ice through my veins. Because if it knows you're listening, it will start listening back. The diner door slammed open. A gust of freezing wind rushed in, rattling the windows. The lights flickered. And then, from somewhere outside, carried on the wind, a whistle. Faint, haunting. The same twisted melody I had heard outside my house, floating through the trees. I went rigid. Maggie let out a sharp breath and turned away, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. The old man stiffened, his face paling. Then, without another word, he shoved his chair back and walked out of the diner, his boots echoing against the floor. He didn't look back. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. I sat there, staring at the open door, my hands slick with sweat. The wind outside had gone still. The whistling had stopped. But the message was clear. It knew. It knew I was here. And now I knew it was listening. I didn't want to be afraid. I didn't want to be like the rest of them, whispering, avoiding eye contact, pretending the rules were just another part of life. I wanted proof. So, on the 6th night, I made a choice. I was going to challenge it. The night air pressed against the house like a living thing, thick and heavy with silence. The wind had died down, the trees standing motionless outside my window. I pulled up a chair and sat in front of the glass, staring into the darkness beyond my yard. I kept the lights off. No distractions. Just me and whatever was out there. And then, I waited. 2 a.m. Nothing. 2:05 a.m. Still nothing. A small, triumphant thought crept in. Maybe this was all just paranoia. A town-wide superstition. Fear feeding fear. 2:07 a.m. Knock. It came slow and steady. The same rhythm as before. 3 seconds apart. I gritted my teeth, gripping the arms of the chair. I didn't move. I didn't respond. I just waited. The knocking stopped. And then a sound cut through the stillness. A whistle. This time, it wasn't distant. It wasn't floating through the trees or hidden behind the wind. It was right outside the window. I froze. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to shut my eyes, to cover my ears, to follow the rules. But I had already made my decision. I opened my eyes. For a second, there was nothing. Just darkness and my own reflection in the glass. Then, something moved. A shadow flickered past the window. Not walking, not running, gliding. It was tall, thin, unnaturally so. Its limbs didn't move as it drifted across my yard, smooth as water, silent as the grave. My breath hitched, every muscle in my body locked in place. Then it stopped, right outside my window. And then, slowly, deliberately, it turned its head. The whistling stopped. For the first time, I understood. I wasn't just watching anymore. It had seen me. I sat there, paralyzed, locked in a silent battle of stillness and breath. Its head was tilted, its face, a void where features should have been, angled just enough to let me know. It knew I was looking. The glass between us suddenly felt paper-thin. A deep, primal instinct clawed at my mind, screaming at me to shut my eyes, turn away, pretend this wasn't happening. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. Seconds stretched into eternity. Neither of us moved. Neither of us made a sound. And then slowly, So slowly I almost didn't notice. It smiled. Not with a mouth, not with lips or teeth, but the darkness where its face should have been bent, curved, split open like something learning how to mimic human expression. And that was when I knew I had made a mistake. The world lurched. For a split second, I felt myself being pulled forward, the glass of the window warping, stretching toward the thing outside. My vision blurred. My ears rang. My mind screamed at me to look away, look away, look away. And somehow, I did. I slammed my eyes shut, gasping, my body trembling with terror. Silence. Nothing. I forced myself to breathe. When I opened my eyes again, it was gone. Morning came, but the world didn't feel the same. Something had changed. Something had shifted. I could feel it. The air in my house felt heavier, like I was no longer alone. Shadows stretched just a little too long. The trees outside stood a little too still. And that night, when the clock struck 2 a.m., the knocking didn't come. The whistling didn't return. But I wasn't relieved, because now I understood. This wasn't over. It had seen me, and now it was waiting for me to see it again. My breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. My pulse thundered in my ears. Number no, no, no. I had only looked for a second. Just 1 second. That shouldn't have been enough. But it was. I pressed my hands over my ears, my face buried against the rough carpet. Don't react, don't react, don't react. That was the rule. And yet, the house was too quiet. No knocking, no whistling, just silence, and a horrible, suffocating certainty. It was still there, watching, waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut, my body curled tight, my hands trembling where they pressed against my ears. I tried to slow my breathing, tried to convince myself it would go away if I didn't acknowledge it. And for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, I had imagined it. Then, from the other side of the window, inches from where I lay, a voice. Software, gentle. Not a growl. Not a snarl. Just a whisper. I see you. A wave of cold terror crashed over me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The voice had been right there. Close enough that if I reached out, if there were no glass between us, I could have touched it. I gritted my teeth so hard my jaw ached. This wasn't part of the rules. There had been no mention of voices, no mention of it speaking. I stayed where I was, face down, body rigid with terror. Seconds crawled by. Nothing. No more whispers. No footsteps. But it hadn't left. I could feel it, still standing there, staring, not knocking, not whistling, just waiting. I don't know how long I stayed on the floor, every muscle screaming in tension. 5 minutes, an hour. Time had lost all meaning. Then, finally, the first hint of sunlight crept through the blinds. And just like that, the feeling vanished. The air in the room lightened. My lungs unknotted, but I still didn't move. Not until the morning light stretched fully across the floor. Not until the weight of its presence had completely, utterly disappeared. Then, and only then, did I push myself up, my limbs shaking like I had just run for miles. I staggered to my feet, swaying. The chair lay overturned beside me. My phone was on the table where I'd left it. 3:58 a.m. It had been here for almost 2 hours, and it hadn't left until the sun began to rise. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to move toward the window. I shouldn't have looked, but I had to. I pulled the blinds apart. The yard outside was empty. The trees were still. But the frost-covered ground told a different story. Right beneath my window, where I had been lying just moments ago, the frost had melted away, as if something had been standing there for hours, watching me through the glass, and next to that, pressed deep into the dirt, a handprint, too long, too thin, fingers stretched impossibly far, ending in points. I staggered back, my throat locking. It had been right there. It had seen me. and now it knew exactly where I was. I didn't sleep the next night, or the night after that. Not that it mattered, because I knew. Even if I closed my eyes, even if I locked my doors, even if I followed the rules perfectly, it wasn't going to leave. Not anymore. Because I had broken the one rule I hadn't known existed. I had let it see me. And now, I wasn't the one watching. It was. Morning came, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. The night had passed, the sun had risen, but I still felt it, the memory of it standing there, whispering to me. I wasn't sure I had the courage to check, but I had to. With a slow, unsteady breath, I walked to the window, grabbed the edge of the curtain and yanked it open, and there they were. Footprints. They started at the tree line, deep imprints in the frost-covered earth, leading straight toward my house. But unlike before, they didn't leave. They ended right beneath my bedroom window, directly below where I had lain on the floor, shaking, barely daring to breathe. The realization settled in my stomach like a lead weight. It had stood there all night, watching me, waiting. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. My mind screamed at me to get out, to leave this house and never return. I didn't even stop to grab a jacket. I grabbed my keys, flung open the door, and drove straight into town. The diner was quiet when I burst through the door, the small bell overhead jingling weakly. A few of the regulars glanced up, but their eyes quickly darted away when they saw my face. Maggie, behind the counter, froze the moment she saw me. She didn't ask what was wrong. She already knew. "You looked at it," she murmured. It wasn't a question. I didn't deny it. I didn't say anything at all. Maggie let out a slow, weary sigh, rubbing a hand over her face. Then, without another word, she reached out and grabbed my wrist, pulling me closer. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You've been marked," she said. "It knows you now, and it won't stop." A cold sweat broke out along my spine. I swallowed hard. "What do I do?" Maggie hesitated. Her gaze flickered toward the other customers in the diner, as if she was afraid of being overheard. Then, finally, she turned and reached beneath the counter. She pulled out a small, dark glass jar and set it down in front of me. I blinked at it. "What is this?" "Black salt," she said. "Spread it around your house every night, every door, every window. Don't leave a single gap." I picked up the jar, my fingers trembling slightly. Inside, the coarse grains of salt gleamed a dull charcoal black. "Will it work?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Maggie didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at me with an exhaustion so deep, so ancient, that it sent a fresh wave of fear through me. "Maybe," she said finally. Then, softer. "But sometimes, it doesn't follow the rules." That night, I followed Maggie's instructions to the letter. I took the jar home, locked the doors, and carefully poured a thick, unbroken line of salt around every entrance, every window frame, every doorway, every threshold. When I was done, I stood in the middle of the room, heart hammering. Was this enough? I didn't know. I didn't trust anything anymore. But I had no other choice. I turned off every light. I sat in bed, my back pressed against the headboard, waiting. And when the clock struck 2 a.m., I listened. For the first time in 2 nights, there was no knock, no whistle, only silence. For a brief, fleeting moment, I let myself believe it was over. Maybe the salt had worked. Maybe somehow, Maggie had saved me. Then, somewhere in the house, a single grain of salt shifted. I went rigid. A breath of cold air brushed against my cheek, and from the darkness, so close I felt it whisper against my ear. A voice, software amused. "You think that will stop me?" And the lights flickered out. That night, I did everything Maggie told me. I spread the black salt around every window, every door. I made sure there were no gaps, no weaknesses. I locked the doors, bolted the windows, pulled the curtains shut. I sat in my bedroom, lights off, hands clenched into fists. I tried not to think about it, tried not to wonder if it was already watching, but it didn't matter. It didn't care. 2 a.m. The knocking started. At first, it was just like before, slow, deliberate, the same pattern, knock, 3-second pause, knock, but this time it didn't stop. Instead, it moved. From the front door, to the living room window, to the wall, to the back door, circling the house, knocking, knocking, knocking. My breath caught in my throat. My grip on the blankets tightened. It had never done this before. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting the seconds between each knock, trying to convince myself that if I didn't react, if I followed the rules, it would go away. Then, the knocking changed. It became lighter, softer, no longer fists, fingertips, a delicate, almost playful tapping against the glass, like someone gently drumming their fingers along the windows, searching for a weakness. I swallowed hard, pressing my hands to my ears. Don't react, don't react, don't react. Then, a voice, right outside the window, low, amused, almost inviting. Let me in. I stopped breathing. The voice wasn't loud, it wasn't demanding. It was a whisper, light as the wind, curling around the edges of my mind. Are you scared? I can hear you breathing. I clenched my jaw, digging my nails into my palms. It was trying to get inside my head. It was playing with me. I didn't respond. I didn't move. Then, the voice changed, and this time, it was my voice. Come outside. A perfect imitation, a mirror of my own tone, my own inflection. Just for a second, a cold sweat broke out along my spine. It was testing me, waiting. If I answered, if I moved, if I acknowledged it, it would win. I bit down on my lip, hard enough to draw blood, and then, suddenly, the knocking stopped. Silence. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it was over. Then, the whistling. Not distant, not at the tree line, right outside my window, close enough that if I turned my head, I would see it. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering against my ribs. It wanted me to look. That was the game. I almost did. Almost. A fraction of a second, a twitch of my neck, but somehow, I stopped myself. I didn't turn, didn't breathe, didn't react. And then, in the silence, the voice whispered one last time, software almost affectionate. See you tomorrow. And just like that, it was gone. The rest of the night passed in unbearable silence. When the first rays of sunlight seeped through my curtains, I finally let out a shaky breath. I had survived. But I knew the truth now. The rules, they weren't about stopping it. They were only meant to delay it, because it wasn't going away. It had seen me. And now, it was playing a game. Morning came. I forced myself to move. The air in the house felt different, not colder, not heavier, just wrong. I checked the salt first. The lines were still intact, no gaps, no smudges, no footprints in the frost outside. For the first time in days, I let out a breath of relief. Maybe it was gone. Maybe last night was just another part of the game. Then I turned to the front door, and my stomach dropped. It was unlocked. I froze. I knew I had locked it. I had triple-checked every bolt, every latch before going to bed, and yet, there it was, the deadbolt unlatched, the chain lock dangling uselessly at the side. Had I forgotten? Had I been so exhausted, so paranoid that I had only thought I locked it? Or something worse? Something much, much worse. Had I never locked it at all? Had I only imagined the feeling of twisting the key, sliding the bolt into place? Had it already been inside, whispering in my mind, convincing me I was safe when I wasn't? A chill ran down my spine. I stepped forward, hesitantly reaching for the door, pressing it open just a fraction, just enough to see the frost outside, untouched. Nothing had come in from outside, which meant if the door had been unlocked all night, it hadn't needed to. I shut the door, slowly, carefully, locked it. This time, I made sure. Then I sat down. I didn't leave the house that day, didn't eat, didn't turn on the TV. I just sat, gripping a knife in my trembling hand, my eyes locked on the hallway, waiting, listening. Because if it was already inside, why hadn't I heard it? I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the chair, knife in hand, back pressed against the wall. I kept every light on. The house was silent. No knocking, no whistling, no voices. But the longer I sat there, the more certain I became. I wasn't alone. It was here. Somewhere inside the house, waiting, watching. I didn't know when it had gotten in. Didn't know if it had always been here, lurking just out of sight, hiding in the places I never looked. I just knew one thing. It didn't need to knock anymore. Because the game had changed. Now, I was trapped inside with it. I had to leave. I didn't care where I went. I just needed to get out of that house. I grabbed my keys with shaking hands, barely remembering to lock the door behind me, as if a lock would do anything. The drive into town was a blur. The roads stretched endlessly through the thick pine forest, twisting and turning under the pale morning light. I didn't feel safe. Not out here, not in the daylight, not anywhere. But I had to find someone. Someone who knew. Someone who could tell me what the hell was happening. The grocery store at the edge of town was small, the kind of place where everything was stacked haphazardly, where the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood. A handful of locals milled about, their voices hushed, their glances brief. I stepped inside, and almost immediately, I felt eyes on me. An old man standing near the counter, his thick, graying beard barely hiding the deep lines of his face. His gaze was heavy, sharp, like he already knew. "You're new," he said, voice rough as gravel. I nodded. My mouth felt dry. I've heard it." His expression darkened. "That's bad enough." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" The old man didn't answer at first. He just looked at me. Really looked at me, as if measuring something. Then, quietly, he said, "No one knows." My stomach twisted. "But it's always been here," he continued, "before the town, before the roads, before any of us." A chill ran down my spine. "It watches," he murmured. "It waits." My throat tightened. How do I stop it? For the first time, his expression shifted. Pity flickered in his tired eyes. "You don't," he said. I stared at him. "That's not—" "You don't," he repeated. I wanted to argue, I wanted to demand answers, but then my eyes flicked past him, and I froze. The bulletin board behind him was covered in missing person flyers. Hundreds of them. Names, faces, descriptions. Some were old, edges yellowed with time from decades ago. But others were fresh, some only months old. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. My fingers clenched against my jacket. I pointed, my voice barely above a whisper. They went outside, didn't they?" The old man exhaled through his nose. "Some of them did," he admitted. I didn't want to ask the next question. I didn't. But I did. "And the others?" He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because I already knew. I felt sick. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. The missing weren't just people who had gone outside at the wrong time. Some of them had stayed inside, followed the rules, locked their doors, and still disappeared, because it didn't always play by the rules. I stepped back. My legs felt weak, my breath shallow. The old man sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. "You should leave town," he said, not unkindly. "If you still can." I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But deep down, I already knew the truth. It was too late. I wasn't just another stranger passing through. I was marked. and no matter where I went, it would follow. I drove back to the house, though I don't know why. Maybe it was because I had nowhere else to go. Maybe it was because part of me still believed, hoped, that if I followed the rules, if I stayed inside, if I did everything right, I could survive. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had never been safe. Not from the moment I arrived. Not from the moment I heard the first knock. Not from the moment I looked at it. And now, it was only a matter of time. That night, I locked the doors, checked the windows, scattered the black salt, but it didn't matter, because at 2 a.m. there was no knock, no whistle, no voice calling from outside. Instead, I felt something shift, something subtle, something wrong. The air in the room grew heavy, and then, from just behind me, a whisper. Close, too close. "I told you," it said. "You can't stop me." My body locked up. The knife was still in my hand, but my fingers had gone numb. Slowly, I turned and saw nothing. The room was empty, but I felt it. It wasn't outside anymore. It was here, in the walls, in the shadows, in me. I don't know how long I sat there, trapped in my own skin, my own house. By morning, I still hadn't moved. By noon, I stopped checking the windows. By evening, I stopped eating. By the next night, I stopped sleeping. And then, on the final night, I finally understood. It had never wanted to take me. It had wanted something worse. It wanted me to belong to it. The rules didn't matter anymore, because when 2 a.m. came, I didn't wait for the knock. I didn't wait for the whistle. I didn't wait for it to whisper my name. I stood up, walked to the front door, and opened it. The cold night air rushed in, but I felt nothing. Beyond the trees, the darkness stretched endlessly, and somewhere, just out of sight, something was waiting, watching, smiling. I stepped forward, and the door swung shut behind me.